This is our final video in the Haunted Halloween Quilt Along. We're gonna put this quilt together so it can rest in one piece. So let me show you the big reveal. You can find part 4 of our Haunted Halloween at Fat Quarter Shop. And don't worry, if you're joining in later, all of these patterns will stay free forever at fatquartershop.com. Make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and let me show you how to put the quilt together. So when you look at this sew along, this was part 1, part 2, and part 3. So it's a very easy assembly. But what I'm gonna do is kind of move some things out of the way, and we're going to go section by section. So on page 1, we're going to be using the bat, the small star, the kitty cat, and a fabric A rectangle. So I've got all of my fabric on the side. So I'm going to put this together, right side together, and I'm going to nest these 2 seams right here and pin. So you have 2 that nest on the right side of the orange square, and then I'm going to pin here. And then when I get over here, I notice these 2 seams don't nest because they're going the same direction. So I'm going to show you what to do when that happens. I'm going to go to my ironing table, and I can't move this seam because if I move this seam, it goes all the way down and it's got a seam down here. But this one doesn't connect to anything. So I'm going to just take my iron and move the seam. And that's that easy to move the seam. And then here, these points need to match right here. So I'm gonna eyeball it this time and see. And then I'm just gonna sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I've got a lot of points here, and I just want to make sure I didn't chop off these points or his ears, and that this nests. So that looks good. I'm going to set my seam and press toward the kitty cat. So you can see that that is done. Now I'm going to add the fabric A to the side of the kitty cat, and I'm going to do the same thing where I pin on each side. And all of these I've cut the exact size, and then here I'm just going to kind of pull it, pin in the center, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam. So here all we're doing is 1/4 inch seams and trying to make sure we don't chop off any points. Set your seam, press to one side. Make sure you don't chop off the star points. And then we're going to add the bat block, just making sure that our bat is flying the correct way. And then here, just put this right side together, pin on each side, and then after I pin each side, I'll see if anything needs to nest. So that's kind of how I always start out, is pin your sides and then figure it out. So right here, that looks like that needs to nest. So I'm actually gonna just put that together. It nests right there, luckily. This one doesn't need to nest over here. But see how this is pulling? I'm gonna pin throughout, but then I'm gonna pin this, and that will kind of keep it in shape and not pull too much. And then we're just going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam, making sure we don't cut off any of these points. So I'm looking at my points, and that lined up, and I didn't chop anything off, so that's great. I'm going to set the seam and press toward my bat block. And then your left section of your quilt is done. So that is page 1 of part 4. I'm going to move this to the side, and then we're going to build the right side. And here we're going to be careful. When we lay this out, you need to lay the one with the rectangle on the left side and no rectangle here, so you've got that. Your fabric B rectangle is going to go next, and I'm going to go ahead and do that one first, and then we'll add the castle. I usually do not sew with a scant 1/4 inch. If your points are getting chopped off, you can use the scant 1/4 inch. I'm using a regular 1/4 inch, but that's my tip to you if your stars are getting chopped off. And just sew with a 1/4 inch seam. Set my seam, press toward the background, And from here, making sure this is in the top right. Now we're gonna add that to our haunted house. And again, just pin, 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 and sew the seam. And the only thing you have to worry about here is not chopping off this little point here. Set your seam. Ooh, so right there, it looks like my iron kind of pulled that. So now we have the right side done. So we're gonna put that here. We're gonna put this next, and then I'm gonna turn it sideways. And I'm gonna kind of look. It does not look like anything needs to line up. So I'm gonna just pin each edge, and this will be our quilt center. And then all we have left to do is add borders. Now, one thing I noticed earlier is right here, this little seam, it's pressed open and it shouldn't be. So what I'm gonna do before I iron is I'm gonna unpick these stitches and sew back over that seam so it's nice and flat. Now this seam, I'm just gonna press toward the left. So we have our quilt center done, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna add fabric C borders to the sides, and then fabric D borders to the top and bottom. Now what I usually do is cut my borders longer, but today I'm gonna show you how, if you've cut your borders the exact size, how to attach those borders. The first thing I'm gonna do is find the center on the sides. Then I've got my fabric C strips cut. I'm gonna find the center of these. Okay, so I'm gonna do the bottom, or one of the borders first. I'm gonna pin both of them though and sew them on at the same time. So the first thing is match your center, match your side on both sides. But if you let this sit like this, this is gonna come out crooked. So you have to pin over here, and that will make your border straight. If you don't do that, it is gonna come out wavy. So that is the only way to make it work if you cut them the exact size. Okay, so here, now that this is, you can see it's kind of pulling because I cut it the exact size. So what I'm gonna do is kind of flatten it and keep it really flat here, and then any extra waviness I'm gonna kind of work in here. And you know, when I usually cut my borders bigger, I usually will cut them a 1/2 inch or 1 inch bigger, but I've shown that so many times. So today I'm gonna show you how to make it work if you've cut. Now you can see this is pulling. You can see there's a big gap right here. You have to kind of push it down, pin, and let that overlap work itself in the center of the quilt. If you don't do this, your quilt is gonna come out and your borders are gonna come in and they're gonna look like this. And I would recommend to do this anytime you're doing borders if you don't cut them larger. This will really help you. So I'm gonna do that on one side, add the second border. Just know that when you do this, you'll probably poke yourself a couple of times, but I prefer to pin at the same time. So I'm just gonna do the same thing on the other side. Now when I go to the sewing machine, I am gonna leave my background fabric side up and just remove the pins as I go. And these pins will be removed after the border is down, so that keeps this from pulling. And to keep the pins kind of out of the way, what you can do is kind of like this and hold it this way. Now when I'm doing borders, I will make a couple stitches and back stitch. Most people do not do that for borders, but I always do it on my borders. The reason I backstitch on the borders is I feel like in a quilt, that's gonna get, the edges is gonna be what's handled the most, and that just adds some security. So even though I put those pins here, you can see how this is already kind of pulled in. So I'm going to show you something with a ruler. You can see there's a little slight dip right there. This one doesn't have one. So here I might need to pull my border fabric just slightly so that it doesn't dip down. So I'm going to put a little pins here to kind of know that it kind of dips a little bit. This one looks fine. And I know I'm super picky about the borders, but I like my quilt to come out square or rectangular, and you can see this one dips a lot. It dips about 1/16 of an inch. And I'm going to kind of show you how to account for that. Now what I'm going to do is take our fabric D rectangles. Those are going to go on the top. I'm going to find my center. Find my center of these. I'm going to match my center. And like I said, this side is fine. So I'm going to pull this one to the very edge, pin the side, pin a little bit in so it's not pulling. Pin these two. This is how you get your corner square and not wavy. Okay, now here, like I said, it kind of dipped down, but you can see, and the way you can see is you pull this over here and you can see that it's straight here, it dips a little, and that's fine. I'm accounting for that, and I'm going to show you when I turn it over. And when I turn that over, there's a little tiny bit right here, but I'm accounting for that pull in. Now this may be a little too kind of detailed for some of you guys, but if you want to know how to get your corner square, the first way you get your corner square is you cut your borders longer, so you don't have to do this. But if you cut your borders this size, this is what you have to do to make it work. So it's kind of up to you which way you prefer. Do the other side, and right there I'll fix that. So you guys in the comments will have to let me know, are you as crazy as me when it comes to borders? Do you cut your fabrics bigger? And I'm doing the same thing. Okay, so here you can just lay it. It's straight right here. And this goes down a little bit, but if you have it straight here and here, it's not gonna be wavy. Okay, so now I'm gonna go over and sew, and again, keep these side pins in until you're done sewing the entire seam. Back stitch. When I'm sewing borders on a quilt, you'll want to keep the weight of the quilt as much as possible on the table so it's not pulling the weight down. And also you're going to use a lot of the left side of your body to hold it in place so it's not pulling. Once I have the back all pressed, I'm going to go all over the quilt. Now, if you start doing this kind of circular motion, you're going to stretch your quilt. If you just keep your iron flat and you move it gently, it's going to get it nice and flat. So now that we've got that done, I'm going to show you what I do when I'm finished with a quilt. So when I'm finished with a quilt, I just want everything to be nice and straight and no threads coming off. So I'm going to take a long ruler and do this. This is going to get my corners even more perfect than they were. And any loose threads are going to come off the edge. So any of those, when I backstitched, all that extra thread comes off. And I kind of tilt my quilt on the side so that I can cut as long as possible. And I've already done that corner. So when I come to this corner, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, when you send if you don't quilt it yourself and you send it to a long arm quilter, if you send it and your corners aren't square, when you get it back and you try to put your binding on, your binding's not going to be square in the corner either. So that's why it's so important to do this. Things like corners, they don't quilt out. And this is basically the same thing I do at the end of each block. Just trim it, get all those excess threads off, and like I said, this is just optional. You don't have to do this. But I do like to send my quilts to my long arm quilter with the front really nice and pressed and the back pressed nice, because it makes it easier for them, and I get a better, they're going to give you a better result the nicer the quilt is when you send it to them. Now another thing I'll do when I send this to my long arm quilter, I will fold it where the wrong side's on the outside. You can either fold it like this. You could also roll it to have less creases, and then you would only have one crease when it gets to the quilter. So those are just some tips from me to you for when you send this to your long arm quilter. Thanks for joining me for the Haunted Halloween Mystery Quilt Along. I'd love to see your finished projects, so share them with me on social media and subscribe to this channel for future quilt alongs. See you then!